Let's talk about run-ons and comma rules and putting sentences together and the punctuation to do so. There are different rules that come into play, and it's a complicated task. You will see a lot of problems related to this on the English grammar section of the exam. Let's start with the idea of an independent clause. An independent clause, you may know, includes a subject, noun, a verb, and it completes a thought. So it stands alone as a sentence. I could put a period at the end of it. A dependent clause lacks a complete thought. It might be missing a subject, noun, or a verb, or have both, but simply lack a complete thought. So it cannot stand alone as a complete sentence. It's worth noting what types of dependent clauses that there are, how we can recognize the dependent clauses. Well, if you're looking at a sentence and it's not completing a thought, you want to continue the sentence, or they feel you need to complete it, you can sense it is a dependent clause. But in practice, when we're reading through the exam, we're going to need a lot of word clues to be able to know and identify certain types of dependent clauses or phrases that need to be punctuated one way or another. We begin with subordinate clauses. They start with subordinating conjunctions. These are words like as, after, although, because, if, since, though, unless, whereas, whether, while. There's a long list, much longer than the list of our coordinating conjunctions, which we know by the acronym FANBOYS, or you may know at this point already. So we don't need to memorize the subordinating conjunctions. You'll recognize them more and more as we practice. The second type of dependent clause you'll run into is a relative clause. These begin with relative pronouns, which, that, who, whom. In addition to the clauses, we have participle phrases and clauses. They begin with the present or the past participle, which is essentially the verb ending in an ing, or the past participle is the verb ending in the ed or enn for irregular verbs. Additionally, we have prepositional phrases. Prepositions denote location, time, and space, and they begin with of, for, at, by, with, in, above, below, etc. There are many prepositions as well. We want to understand how to punctuate these phrases, just like we want to know how to combine and punctuate dependent clauses. It's worth noting that all of these clauses and phrases act as modifiers, which means they're modifying another word as an adjective, as an adverb, much like the blue truck. Blue is an adjective modifying truck. Well, relative clauses generally act as adjectives as well. They modify certain words. John, who wore the blue tie. Who wore the blue tie is modifying John as an adjective. How do I combine independent clauses to independent clauses? It's not always about what sounds best or what sounds good. For example, let's look at the sentence, John runs and he is fast. And John runs, he is fast. Are these correct? Are they correct ways to combine these sentences? John runs. That completes a thought. It's a very simple sentence, but it has a subject, noun, a verb, and completes a thought. He is fast. Also an independent clause. Has a subject, noun, a verb, and completes a thought. How do I combine these independent clauses? Can I do it with just and? Well, many students would say, sure, that sounds good. Problem is, you cannot just use what we call a coordinating conjunction, and. Our coordinating conjunctions are denoted by the acronym FANBOYS, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Say that 3 times fast, you'll probably remember it for life. FANBOYS, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Well, what do we need? We need a comma before the coordinating conjunction. Normally we don't. When we're combining verbs, nouns, adjectives, John and Bob, run and jump, we don't use a comma before our coordinating conjunctions, our FANBOYS. But if we're combining independent clauses, in this special case, I must have a comma before the and. Now I've correctly combined independent clauses. Without that, that's a run-on sentence. Run-on sentences are not necessarily long sentences. They're incorrectly combined independent clauses. How about the second example? John runs, comma, he is fast. Well, yeah, after I say John runs, I want to pause. So that sounds okay to me too, or to many students. But again, that's incorrect. That's what we call a comma splice. I cannot simply have a comma between 2 independent clauses. The correct way to do that is perhaps put a semicolon. So I'll make it the period over the comma, which we call a semicolon. It's essentially the same as a period. And it allows us to combine independent clauses. In fact, that's the main reason in life for a semicolon, to combine independent clauses. There's some other secondary uses, but that's the main reason for it. So if we look at our rules to combine independent clauses, it's fairly straightforward. We can either put a period between them, sure, because they're sentences by themselves. Or I can use a semicolon, or actually a semicolon with some conjunctive adverb, as we would call it. Don't worry about the name, but those are words like however with a comma, moreover, comma, consequently, comma. With those after a semicolon, that's perfectly fine as well. The third way to combine independent clauses is to use a comma plus one of our coordinating conjunctions, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. So these are the ways I will combine independent clauses. And if I need to make sure a semicolon or a comma with a fanboy is correct, I'm always going to be checking for an independent clause before and an independent clause after. So, okay, that's great. I know how to combine independent clauses now. What about dependent clauses and independent clauses? Well, if my dependent clause is up front, then I always separate my dependent clause with a comma. It's always going to be dependent clause, comma, independent clause. That's a straightforward rule. For example, tired from the trip, comma, John sleeps. Anytime I have a dependent clause up front, I don't care if it's subordinating, relative, participle clause, etc., always separated by a comma. Likewise, short words and phrases, especially standalone words, will be separated by a comma as well, analogous to a dependent clause. For example, adverbs, consequently, comma, transition words, however, comma, even if I said yes, comma, John, come over here. These are separated up front by commas. Prepositions, if they're long enough, will be separated by commas up front as well, but you can have prepositions short enough that you might not separate them by commas. What if my dependent clause follows my independent clause? Well, according to the rules, there really is no rule to put commas or any punctuation in that case. Okay, that's fine and well. So if I have a subordinating conjunction or a subordinate clause at the end, John runs because, my subordinating conjunction beginning my subordinate clause, because he is fast, I don't need any additional punctuation. In fact, for subordinating clauses, if it's up front, I need to separate it by commas, but if it's at the end, I generally don't need commas. However, there are a couple exceptions to this. Whereas and although. If they appear at the end of the main or independent clause, we generally do use a comma before them. Additional to that is while. While can mean whereas he went left, whereas or while I went right. They're in opposition. But if while has a temporal notion, I waited while the doctor finished up with his last patient, then I don't use a comma. So when while means whereas, I use a comma. When while doesn't mean whereas, I treat it like any other subordinating clause at the end. It typically does not use a comma. Okay, what about the next sentence? John runs, comma, which is healthy. Which is healthy is the dependent clause. Why is there a comma before it? Notice which is a relative pronoun, which means we have to revert to our restrictive versus non-restrictive comma rules. So if we think about it, independent clauses, we had some simple rules we can memorize. Dependent clause up front was pretty simple. We just have to separate it by a comma. But in many cases, when our dependent clause is in the middle or at the end of the sentence, we have to do this more complicated assessment. We have to review the restrictive versus non-restrictive clause comma rules, which basically say if it's restrictive, it's essential identifying information, and we don't need to separate it by commas. On the other hand, if it's non-restrictive, it's extra information, and we generally separate that by commas. So in this case, which is treated as extra information and separated by commas. Okay, well, what about the next sentences? John, comma, who runs often, comma, is healthy. Well, here's an example of my dependent clause, who runs often, in the middle of the sentence. It is also starting with a relative pronoun, so it's a relative clause, and I need to assess whether it's restrictive or non-restrictive. Well, in this case, I've already identified who it is, John. So once I mention that he runs often, that becomes extra information. It's not essential. I've already identified the person. So I need to separate that by commas. It's a non-restrictive clause. Compare that to the next sentence. The boy that runs often is healthy. Notice that runs often is also a relative pronoun starting a relative clause. Only in this case, we don't use commas. Part of the reason there is the boy has not identified who we're talking about yet. It could be any boy. That runs often. We want the boy that runs often, not the boy sitting back watching TV at home. It's specifically the boy that runs often. Therefore, we're identifying who it is. It's restrictive and generally does not get separated by commas, which is why we don't put punctuation in there. This gives rise to a word clue that can be really helpful. Which and that are both relative pronouns, and they basically mean the same thing in a sentence. But which is always preceded by a comma. It's always treated as non-restrictive or extra information, and that is never preceded by a comma. It's always treated as restrictive, and therefore it doesn't take punctuation. So that can be really helpful if you see those words on the exam. You'll know whether you need the comma or not. A couple of things here to note. Generally, I don't like the idea of using commas as a pause to put in commas as a primary method because, well, we pause a lot, and therefore we probably put in a lot of commas all over the place, and we end up over punctuating with commas and get the wrong answers. Another method I've seen people use is try to pull out the non-restrictive clause, and if the sentence reads okay, or basically the same, well, then they separate it by commas. But in the last case, the boy that runs often is healthy. I could pull out that runs often and say the boy is healthy, and I might still think, oh, that reads just fine, not too different than what I had before. When in point of fact, it really doesn't because we don't know what boy we're talking about. So in that case, we could end up over punctuating our clauses in the middle of sentences. So let's take a moment to review the general outcomes we're going to get from subordinating clauses, relative clauses, participle phrases, prepositional phrases, when they occur at the beginning, middle, and end of sentences. Well, the beginning was simple. Dependent clause at the start uses a comma. I don't care if it's a subordinating clause, a relative clause, or if it's a prepositional phrase or a participle phrase. We put a comma between the dependent clause and the independent clause. What about a subordinating clause in the middle? Well, oftentimes in the middle, it will be separated by a comma. John, because he is tall, was very good at basketball. I would put a comma before because and after tall to separate that. However, the reality is we generally won't put subordinating clauses in the middle of sentences. Yeah, I shouldn't say that because there are probably several exceptions with though and although. But if I said John was good at basketball because he was tall, that's a much better way to say that sentence with a subordinating clause. So in that case, it's no comma in general for subordinating clauses at the end. However, remember we had exceptions. The exceptions were whereas and although. They would be preceded by comma even if my subordinating conjunction and subordinate clause was at the end of the sentence. And of course, while as well when it means whereas. Okay, what about the relative clauses? In the middle of a sentence, well, that comes to our restrictive versus non-restrictive rule. It may or may not be punctuated by commas. We have to do that assessment. And at the end, we have to assess the restrictive versus the non-restrictive clause rules. Okay, how about participle phrases or clause? Well, remember, participle clauses and phrases, they basically act as adjectives, much like relative clauses, so they're also subject to the restrictive versus non-restrictive rules, which means we're going to get much the same outcome that we have to check the rules for restrictive versus non-restrictive. However, in the case of participle clauses or phrases at the end, quite often we actually separate it by a comma. You'll see it very often that's the case. John did his homework, comma, including math and science. We put a comma before the present participle, including, and we usually see that that is the case. The only time we don't is when that participle appears right next to the word and it's essential. I saw the dog wagging its tail. Well, wagging is modifying the dog, and it's essential to tell me what dog. So in that case, I wouldn't put a comma. But at the end, it's usually non-restrictive and takes commas. How about prepositional clauses and phrases? Well, they should apply, as pretty much any phrase does, to the same restrictive versus non-restrictive rule. However, there is something true in practice for prepositional phrases. Prepositional phrases are almost never preceded by commas. They're treated as though restrictive. And I'll give you an example. Usain Bolt won the relays in California at the Modesto Relays on July 4th. In, at, on, all prepositions at the end of the sentence, and even in the middle. None of them are preceded by commas. You wouldn't even pause, so you wouldn't even think to put a comma there. That's typically the case for prepositions. This is not exactly a hard and fast rule. There are a couple of exceptions that we've seen on the exam, with and by. So in the last example, Usain Bolt won the Modesto Relays in California on July 4th, comma, with a time of 9.86 seconds. That's extra information separated by a comma. Finally, we wouldn't be able to answer a lot of questions correctly if we didn't also understand colons and substitute parenthetical punctuation. These punctuation marks appear on numerous answer choices, so you need to assess whether they're going to be correct or not. What is a colon? What does it do? A colon starts with a main clause, usually up front. It could be at the end, but 99.9+% of the time, it's going to be at the start. So assess if it's an independent clause before the colon. And then what follows the colon is going to be an example or examples in the case of a list, or something that elaborates on what is said in the first part before the colon. Look at the following examples. I went to the store to buy some items, colon, milk, butter, and eggs. Note I have an independent clause before the colon, and I have a list after the colon. It's a very typical use of a colon. Here's a very typical mistake in red. The items I bought consisted of colon, milk, butter, and eggs. Problem there is I don't have an independent clause there. The items I bought consisted of, that doesn't complete the sentence. Therefore, that's not going to work. But essentially, the colon provides an elaboration or example of what came before the colon. In the cases of elaboration, that can often be an independent clause. She offered a solution, colon, the team needs more practice. So wait, why isn't that not on our independent clause combination list? We do see independent clause, colon, independent clause in some cases. The use of it is a little different than a semicolon. It's more to provide examples and elaborate on what was stated before the colon. How about substitute parentheticals? We've been talking about whether we use commas or not commas when we combine independent and dependent clauses. You should understand that there are replacement punctuations for parentheticals. When I have a dependent clause set off by commas, it could also be set off by parentheses, and it could be set off by what we call an EM or a long dash. So for example, John, comma, who wore his blue tie, comma, that's in parenthetical, a dependent clause set off by commas on both sides in the middle of the sentence, had an excellent interview. Well, likewise, we could say John, long dash, who wore his blue tie, long dash, had an excellent interview. And John, parentheses, who wore his blue tie, parentheses, had an excellent interview. So for test purposes, these are essentially the same. Now, there's some subtle differences that one might be better in one circumstance than others. A long dash can do some things that a comma can't do, and occasionally can even substitute for a colon. But for test purposes, just recall, commas, parentheses, or long dashes are generally substitute parenthetical punctuation. If you made it this far, congratulations. In less than 20 minutes, we've hopefully pulled together a series of disparate rules that will help you gain functional skills to better answer English grammar convention problems that deal with run-on sentences and combining independent and dependent clauses. Good luck. We wish you good fortune.